I'm Jackie Gurdon. It's August 2011. This afternoon I'm with Les Wright, and Les, we're going to be talking about the history of the West Coast Road between Greymouth and Westport. Les, an early sketch from Heafy. Tell us about this.
Oh, the first adventure tourist, I suppose you could say. This is Brunner and the poor unfortunate dog Rover being hauled up the Tomiko cliffs just north of Punakaiki, sketched by Mr. Heafy in something like 1846 when they were down doing their first little sortie down the west coast to see if there was anything worth going down there for in the future. And of course Brunner's conviction after that trip and another one later that was even worse was that there was nothing. It'd be good enough for a prison farm or something like that. Didn't find any grazing country, in other words. And of course, on his second trip, poor old Rover went on the pot and ended up as the first hot dog on the west coast, or whatever you like to say. But yeah, great picture, isn't it? And it's what Heafy would have taken if he'd had a camera. This is the coast road, all up around about the 11-mile mark, if you know where that is, just when you're going between 10 mile and 12 mile. It's still recognisable. The road takes a fewer ducks and dives now, but this section up here to Dalzell's place is just off to the right there, going north, still quite recognisable, except now, of course, it's tar seal. And that's the thing you have to remember, is the coast road has been, it seems windy enough today, but it has been considerably straightened out compared with what it used to be. Another one from the early motoring age. This looks like somewhere like the 12 mile where you come down by the cliffs even now today, and still bits falling off the cliff. Again, the road is now tar sealed, and down to your left you've got quite a drop down into the sea from there.
It's great seeing it like it used to be. The coast road is named, 7 mile and 10 mile. Do you know where that came from?
Well, someone would say it was from the Mile family, who weren't very imaginative in naming their kids or giving them numbers. That was the old diggers' miles, and you get the same thing in Central Otago. And they just, in fact, they say that the diggers' miles on the west coast were actually shorter than in Central Otago because you were walking on beach or fighting your way through the scrub or something like that. But those miles that you get up the coast road are distances from Greymouth, and remembering that they were going up the beach all the way from the Grey River mouth. They weren't coming through Runanga as we do now. So you got to what is now Rapahoi, and that was 7 mile, and then you got up to the 10 mile and the 12 mile, and you could get right up. I've seen Punakaiki referred to as 26 mile or 27 mile. And then further north nowadays, of course, you get past Punakaiki and up to the upper limits of the present Paparoa National Park, and you'll get to 4 mile, and that is 4 mile coming back from Charleston in the opposite direction. So it was a matter of where you were coming from and where you were going to a great extent. But this is universal. You'll find these mile places all over the west coast, and I haven't heard of a place called in kilometres, but I suppose it's only a matter of time.
That could be a latest tourist attraction, calling it kilometres rather than miles, I suppose.
Well, you think some of these people that they have in the way of surveyors, like Theophilus Mabel, he might have called a place so many kilometres even back in the 1860s, but he never did. He stuck with miles as well. This would be from 17 Mile Bluff looking south, I would think. You'd get Motukiki rocks away in the distance, and of course on a fine day you'd get a splendid view of Mounts Cook and Mount Tasman and some of the other southern Alps. And here again the road hasn't really changed that much, except it's black with a white line down the middle of it. This would be from 17 Mile Bluff going the opposite way from the previous one, and I think this one's an early coloured, might have been hand tinted or probably just an early coloured photo. Anyway, looking north to, I suppose, what we now call Barrytown Beach, but in those days was 17 Mile Beach, and away in the distance you have Punakaiki, and up to the right just those spurs rising directly onto the Paparoa Range. Fairly spectacular sort of a place, and the Tasman Sea at the left.
Les, this is a really interesting photo. It's Barrytown. What era?
early 1900s, I would think. It's actually from an old greeting card. The thing that's different, if you're looking towards the south, and if you can envisage Barrytown now, where you come across and cross the bridge, and nowadays you'd go straight ahead through the middle there. There's the All Nations Hotel just on the right of that gap, I would think. And now, but in those days, that was just called the Mill Road, I think it was. There was a flax mill down there. If you were travelling on the main road, you took a right-hand bend before that far group of buildings, and you went down to the beach and then along the beach. And it wasn't until comparatively recent times, with all the coastal erosion, that they actually moved the main road to go to where it is now. And yeah, Barrytown, a much bigger, more bustling sort of a place, if that's bustling, as we always say about towns with a population of more than 10 people. But yeah, a much bigger place than it is today, I guess.
So how did Barrytown, what did it grow out of? Was it gold mining?
Oh yes, gold mining. It was one of the last rushes that there was in the 1870s. Even after Kumara, you get told a lot that Kumara was the last gold rush, and of course Rimu would say that they had the last gold rush. Well, in between them there was the Barrytown rush. It was basically they'd picked up the lead as far as south as Canoe Creek back in the 1860s, but it wasn't picked up south of Canoe Creek until 1870, whatever it was, 78, 79. And one of the parties that was working a terrace behind this area was Barryan Party. Fine bunch of Irishmen, I guess. So there was Barry's Terrace, and then they established the town just below Barry's Terrace, and so it became just Barrytown, or Barryville at one stage. And I think at another stage it had a fancy name like Fosbury or something, and another time it was named after Commissioner Kinnersley, but Barrytown is the one that has won out over the rest. These are some black sanders, and that's something that's gone on in these big open shingle beaches, the length of the west coast, I suppose, but it's very fine gold. Originally would have been nuggets and things washed down the river into the sea, which is ground it up into fine gold, and then it would cast it ashore. And these people would wait till the beach cut, as they called it, and that was when the sea would cut back the overburden and leave the black sand containing the gold. And then they'd be there, sometimes just in between tides, heaving it up above the high water mark so they could put it through their boxes at their leisure. And it was just basically a matter of shoveling it through boxes that would have had something like plush matting, or if they were really well off, copper plates coated with mercury to catch that very, very fine gold. And yeah, I think the most famous places for that would have been 5 Mile Beach, Okarito, and up north of Punakaki at Charleston. But here they are, somewhere on Barrytown Beach, and doing pretty well. What did they call it? Haymaking, I think it was, maybe because of this golden stuff that you were shoveling into a box. But yeah, it was certainly a matter of making hay anyway while it was there, because it wasn't there forever. And I think it's been a good few years since the Barrytown Beach cut the way it used to. Yeah, this is just zeroing in on the hotel, the All Nations Hotel. That was the name that has survived here in Barrytown. It had other ones. The hotel itself hasn't survived, like so many. It burned down at one stage, and its replacement is still going strong. And the most important thing is the name, because there were all these various names, some of them related to particular groups, or of course, they used to like to have the name, say, reflecting the previous rush too. That's why you get the Dunedin Hotel in one place. I think Ross had a Dunedin Hotel. There were Otago hotels on the west coast, and you go over to Australia and you'll find West Coast hotels, referring back to the previous rushes. You get other hotels with the names of people of various nationalities, but this one, there was no doubt, they welcomed everybody pretty well, and it was called the All Nations. Of course, the next development from black sanding was to build a gold dredge, and Barrytown had two of them. There was the White's Electric, and there was this one, the Barrytown dredge, which was made in the 1930s with a lot of foreign capital. I think White's Electric was the first all-welded one too, I believe, and I think it finally made its way up the Grey Valley somewhere. They moved it. It didn't do well at Barrytown, and nor did this one really. You were working on what had been Kahikatea swamp forest on the old overgrown beaches, working very fine deposits, and I think one of the problems was the pond used to get so murky that a lot of the gold just clung to the mud and went out over the back again. But for all that, it did dig up a fair bit of gold until it finally, I think this dredge got moved off to Australia, where it worked for many years after that.
So much gold out of Barrytown overall?
Oh yes, I would think a colossal amount off the terraces and off the beaches. But as I say, with this one, the big problem was just saving it. The gold was certainly there, but everybody you talk to who had anything to do with this dredge seems to think that as much probably went over the back of the dredge after the processing as was kept to put in the bank, and that was probably the difference between just keeping it going for years but not returning a handsome profit as it potentially could have done. This is up the top end of 17 Mile or Barrytown Beach, just before you get to Punakaiki. You can go down, I think they call it McMillan's Road, onto the beach and walk north, and you'll walk into a gut. The top part of the arch fell off, I think, in the late 1970s, but it's still a pretty intriguing and spectacular sort of a place to go in and have a look. It's far more overgrown than it looks here now, but certainly worth the walk up the beach to have a look. In that vicinity too, there was a lot of historic stuff. That's where I think Wilkie's Hotel was in the 1860s. That was as far up the beach from Greymouth as you could get on a horse until they built the inland pack track in 1867. So there was a hotel there with stables and things, and you could hire a horse, ride it up to there, and then carry on foot up the beach highway, if we like it. And the horse would probably go back to Greymouth with the next person who wanted to hire something, a bit like we have with one-way rental car systems nowadays. But this was, the entranceway, the end of the easy going and getting into that really difficult coastline around Punakaiki. Over the other side of that, I forgot to mention at 17 Mile too, you come to the formation they called the Razorback, and it's just between that, where that rock fort, as they called it in the previous photo, and the sea, there is a spur running up from the beach, a very sharp topped spur that the diggers used to balance their way along the top of, and I gather that's how they got the name Razorback, and that's the name that headland is now known as. And you drive up over that, and this would be a view from the top of it looking down to the Punakaiki River, and the river coming out from the right, and then over the other side was Simpson's Farm in the old days, and then beyond that out to the left out of the picture would have been the Pancake Rocks, the famous Punakaiki Pancake Rocks that didn't really get a mention in the early days, but became more important when people had time to stop and look at things like that, and we got tourism. This is from the 1920s when the road finally got to Punakaiki from Greymouth. It went in various stages. For a long time they used to go around the rocks at 10 Mile, for example. In fact, that's a photo we don't have here. There's great photos of them taking mining pipes and things on the wagons that used to go up the beach and around the bluffs around 10 and 12 miles and places like that. And it wasn't until 1922, I think, that they finally got a road to Punakaiki. And when they were doing that, of course, people started taking an interest in building themselves a batch so they wouldn't have to drive back the same day. And that's when we got these first batches on the Greymouth side of the Punakaiki River. And some of the more prominent families in Greymouth built themselves batches, and that was their little weekend retreat. Once you got to the Punakaiki River, there was the problem of getting across it. There was a footbridge, an old suspension bridge, for a long time just upstream there. You can probably almost see it up past the batches. But that wasn't replaced by a road bridge until the 1930s, so before that you just forded the river. And this one seems, even today, seems fairly far down the river to be fording, but you've got to remember that the mouth has moved inland quite a bit over the years, so there was probably still quite a bit more beach out of the photo out to the right in those days. The big pool before you get to the mouth would have been further, well, close to the present sea now. So anyway, obviously that was the good fording place at that time anyway, and there it is, the old, probably an old sea cab Model T or something like that, crossing the river. This is a more recent photo from mid-1980s, but I've included that because these are some of a pioneering family, and I've done quite a bit of oral history around the Punakaki area, and one of the first people one of the people whose memories went further back was the old guy in the middle. That was Jack Powell, who'd been born at Charleston in 1901. And so in his mid-80s, we took him back up the Punakaki River, where he had been quite a bit as a boy. His uncle had land up there, and they had built that homestead. And by the time he was in his 80s, it was just about falling down. It was pretty well riddled with borer, but there was enough of it there to get the family, and that's 4 generations of his family all lined up there outside what had been the Powell homestead, up Deadman's, as he always called it. It was always Deadman's to the old ones, not the Punakaki River. The Punakaki name regained strength later on, but in those days it was named after, in the gold rushes, a body had been found at the mouth of the Punakaki River in about 1866, when the gold diggers were starting to go through to the Brighton and Charleston rushes. And because that was a reference point, Deadman's the river became. And they went up there, they farmed for many years, or Jack and his uncle and his brother, I think. He told me all sorts of stories, like getting the first plough there. They took it from Charleston as far as they could in the old dray, and then to the end of the road, which was way up White Horse Hill somewhere then. And then they unloaded it and got it down to the beach, which was still part of the highway in those days, and then he and his brother took turns, one riding the horse and one steering the plough, and they got it all the way to Punakaki, and then ploughed up the Punakaki Valley with that plough. So that was one of the sort of stories that he told me. The other thing I say, refer to Charleston, as we call it now, as Charleston. That is in respect to Jack, who, in the old manner of the era and the place and the era, always pronounced Charleston. Well, here we are across the Punakaki River, and this is just where Neil Mowat now has his horse trekking business. And in the earlier days, that paddock was quite a nice sort of an orchard, if you like, of Nico palms, until they were taken away partly by the sea and also partly felled in order to increase the size of the paddock back in the 1920s or so. Now in the background you can see Razorback Point, and you can tell the date of that photo, any photo of there, because around about 1929 the end of the point fell off. So if you look at photos later than that, you can see the point is somewhat shorter than it is now. The place this has been taken from is about where the Punakaki Hotel villas now are, and the hotel itself would be out of view out to the right. And there the main road, just a bit of a track. I think it might have just been becoming a road by then. Once they actually bridged, or once they got a better fording place, they extended the road through there and finally put the first road bridge in about the early 1930s. The other thing is one of the stories from the Simpsons, who were the family who lived there. Their homestead was about where the hotel is now. Those children lived there. They'd never seen, well, they got to Barrytown and they thought that was a big place. They had never seen people in groups of more than about half a dozen until then. And they lived in a place where treats were in very short supply, and to them, for a treat, you couldn't just go down to the lolly shop and spend your pocket money. Their biggest treat was actually to cut down a Nico palm and get into the heart, up at the top, where the heart of where the leaves came from, and there's quite a sweet centre there. and they would cut that out and eat that. Probably not so bad for their teeth as sweets were, but they were forbidden to do that actually by their parents, who were fairly conservation minded and realised that if you did this you were killing the palm tree. But to them it was such a treat they'd sneak off and go and do it anyway. Haven't included the Simpsons in this lineup, but we do have their goats, and these goats were quite special because they were Angora goats, apparently, and some of them will have got into the local goat gene pool, although I've seen a few goats about Punakaiki in the last 30 years. I haven't seen one that looked anything like an Angora. But one thing that Jimmy Simpson did, he had a magnificent garden because he had plenty of lime to put on it, for one thing, but his little sideline was strawberries, and he grew magnificent strawberries, apparently, the size of pumpkins, if you believe some of the exaggeration. But anyway, strawberries were the thing, and he also had the goats, so he had milk, and he'd have cream, and strawberries and goat's cream were his sideline for what there was in the way of tourism that was going by in the 1920s. That wasn't a great deal. In fact, going back to Jack Powell, Jack's recollection was in the days around about World War One, people were living, he said it was an existence, was all you could call it. They'd be living very much a subsistence sort of a lifestyle. And sometimes if the county overseer was going past and he had a look at you and thought you were in need of a good feed or a bit of money, he might give you a bit of a road-making contract or something like that, just to get you by for a bit longer. And then you would just go back to getting whatever you could out of your garden, or going fishing, or in the case of Jimmy Simpson, supplementing that with strawberries and cream for anyone who came past and wanted something just a bit fancy in the way of food. And from Jimmy Simpson's goats, here we have another goat that was fairly prominent around Punakaiki up till the 1970s. I think when the tea rooms burned down, the goat may have gone with it. But this was one of those things where you just put your head through the hole and had your photo taken. And I just rather wonder if it's something that we could even put back again for historic reasons, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's really quite good, and there was this real story behind it too, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's I've found it quite remarkable. I think I've been sent two pictures of it with different people's heads, of course, but obviously a lot of people used to use it, and similar photos will be in many, many family albums, I'm sure. Now, I mentioned the tea rooms, and here they are, and they were built in the 1930s, I think, about where the car park is, just south of the present visitor centre at Punakaiki. And you see you've got the little Fordson truck, probably Kirker late 1940s, pulled up beside it. So that photo's probably taken in the 50s or 60s, and the place did burn down in the 1970s. This one would have been taken just outside the tea rooms, and amazing the cars that were getting there once there was a road in the late 20s, and especially once the rivers were all bridged in the early 1930s. That's when all the tourists started coming. And not only tourists, local people. This is actually Mrs. Forrest, a well-known greymouth family. They had the... not the brewery, but they did have a hotel. I think it was the Recreation Hotel, and they had the cordial factory for a long time, I think, the family. But anyway, Mrs. Forrest was quite an adventurer, and she had a lovely big V8, Ford V8. That's probably about a 36 or so Ford V8 that she used to do a lot of driving around in, and one of the places she would go to quite often was Punakaiki. And there she is outside the tea rooms, and the sign there, no great blue signs and brown signs and things that we have today, just a simple AA sign probably telling people they could go and see the local attraction. The attraction, of course, being the Pancake Rocks. Interesting that none of those early travellers like Heafy, Brunner, Haast, etc. even mentioned them. They did describe the coastline. Charles Money was one who does a great description of the coastline further south of Punakaiki, but the Pancake Rocks never got a mention, probably because the only track through went inland of them, about where the present main road did, and there would be so much bush that people wouldn't have even realised that they were there to any great degree, I wouldn't think, because they're not that evident from the beach on either side, particularly when you leave the beach a bit earlier to go up the hill. And people were more intent in getting from A to B. But it's hard to believe that there weren't people who walked on the beach sometimes and saw the blowholes working, or even heard them, the sound they made from the beach, and went for a look. But you don't get written accounts of them until probably the 1930s or something, when people were starting to go through and tourism was starting to develop. Local children, though, could, if they were lucky, take passers-by down, guide them down, because there was only a bit of a track down there to them and no bridges and things as there are now, and the children might get sixpence or something, which was a small fortune for guiding people down to them. You see there's a fellow there in the bathing suit, sort of bathing suit we need nowadays with the sun being so harmful, but I don't think he was actually swimming there, but he's just made his way up there, as you did, I suppose. It was just part of the place that you wandered round in. Back in the distance too, there you can see the Razorback Point again, so there's the Punakaiki River flowing out. Did I mention no bridges? There were no barriers either. In fact, there are plenty of people alive now who could remember when you used to get into places like this. This is actually an old photo. I think it was in the New Zealand Freelance paper, which some people will remember. It was going up to about the 1960s, and it used to have a centre part with lots of photos in it, and periodically the pancake rocks would get in there, and this was one such photo, and people probably saw that and thought, oh, I must go there and do that, and surprisingly there are no accounts of people having fallen in and got themselves drowned. But eventually, of course, these places were barricaded off, partly to keep the people out of danger, but also to stop people from trampling the rocks, because with so many people going there, they were starting to get rather scuffed in places. So, yeah, they've looked a lot better since people were kept off them. The other thing that was up on Dolomite Point at Punakaiki, where the northern car park is, just past the cafe, was the Punakaiki School. And that was pretty interesting too, because it had come from Fox River in the days before there was a road. Like you get with schools in rural areas now, you get your fluctuations in population, and it came to the point in the 1920s, I think early 1920s, where there was no need for a school at Fox River. So, and there was need for one at Punakaiki, so instead of building one there, they got a local fellow called Sam Price to move the school. And so Sam Price did that. Apparently he might have broken it down into two pieces maybe. He loaded it on sleds and then just snigged it all the way from Brighton to Punakaiki, including around Mabel Bay, which would have been a very narrow track just clinging to the cliff like the present day road does, and put it at Punakaiki. And it was there for several years, and then it got moved again down and did its final service down at the motor camp before it was finally dispensed with. But the local children, they were the first tourist guides, as I may have mentioned. They would be around, and if someone wanted to be shown this new attraction, which people were starting to hear about, the pancake rocks and blowholes, the kids would be there and would take the people down, sometimes at the expense of their school lessons, so they could expect to go home at the end of the day with maybe a sixpence in the pocket, but also a very sore hand that they'd be rubbing against the side of their leg to cool it down. Just some of the local pupils, and this was the O'Callaghan family and the three children on their way to school. One is the little girl with the handkerchiefs around her ankles. That was because when she walked, she tended to bang the knuckles of her feet together, so she had those there to stop her, apparently. But yeah, they would sometimes ride a horse. They lived up where the Truman Track is now, so you imagine what an expedition that was to get to school when you had to cross the Pororari River, and especially on a horse when you had to swim it across in all sorts of weather. There was a footbridge there. And then they would go along the beach and then walk up and through the cutting to school. And that old cutting is still there. It's all fully overgrown now of Nico palms and goodness knows what. But if you just go to the top of the hill from the Pororari beach, when you come up past where that horrible wire netting fence is, and just as you get to the limestone, looking on your right, you can see the cutting still going through there. And nowadays there's a bigger cutting inland from it that the main road goes through. So that's where their photo was taken, and that was apparently taken by a travelling photographer back in the 1930s. So even then there were photographers starting to do the rounds and take pictures of people, sort of candid snaps and that sort of thing. Another thing about school children going in those days, one woman, as she was when I spoke with her, reminisced that she always carried her shoes to school and then put them on at school, but she wouldn't wear them to school because that would wear them out. And she always thought how hard her father had worked to buy her those shoes, so she was going to keep them for best and not wear them out by wearing them along the stony, gravelly road or whatever they had to walk along to get to school. Of course, these kids, if they were walking to school, they were partly at least walking along the beach, which was slightly easier going. Well, here we are on Pororari Beach. Could be just about any beach, I suppose, but I've put this one in just to show that people were enjoying leisure time in that area in the 20s and probably taken this in the 30s there. There's one guy in that photo who looks to me like Mr. Gandhi, but you might be able to spot him. But and they probably ride those horses up from Greymouth in many cases, although there were plenty of horses, I suppose, in those days around the paddocks. Talking of transport to the place too, there used to be another means of getting to Greymouth up to places like Punakaiki. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it was called sharing a bicycle. So you had two people and only one bike. So what would happen would they'd both set out from Greymouth at the same time, pretty much, one walking and one riding the bike. The one riding the bike might get out to, say, Coal Creek and then leave the bike and start walking. And the other one would walk up till he found where the bike was, hop on the bike and start riding. And he might get along to, say, Runanga and then leave the bike and start walking. And the other fellow would walk up till he got the bike and then ride on and maybe leave it at Rapahoe. And that way leapfrogging each other all the way to Punakaiki. That was sharing a bicycle. Of course, nowadays you would leave the bike the first time, the next guy would get up and wouldn't find it because someone would have nicked it probably. But that's just the imaginative sort of way. And when you think about it, that's the fairest way you could have possibly done it, taking turns at riding and walking. This photo is just across the Pororari Bridge. In fact, you might be able to see the end of the Pororari Bridge in the background, the first old timber bridge. But this is looking, from the Westport side, looking back through the trees. That bit of road is still there, but it's pretty much overgrown now because they built the present bridge just downstream from the old one. But also gives you a glimpse, apart from the sorts of beautiful cars they used to drive in those days, but also just a bit of a glimpse of how our roads were, in case we've forgotten it. So much of our scenery has given way to roads, and you don't get these little drives through the bush that the way you used to get them in those days. But those big, huge rata trees, mostly those magnificent northern rata trees that still grow. Well, the same trees would be there. Some of them have come down, but largely still there on the Westport side of the Pororari River. Yeah, very interesting, this one, in terms of early West Coast and New Zealand aviation, because this photo would have been taken by Bert Mercer, the person who started New Zealand's first commercial airline, or passenger airline, out of Hokitika in the 1930s. And this is a flight that obviously two planes did, a couple of Dragonflies, I think they would be, de Havillands, down the coast road in the 1930s. There is another photo taken just a bit further north at Mabel Bay, but this one is above the Pororari River. So down there you can see the old timber bridge that I mentioned a moment ago. Off to the right of that you'd have the township now. The present-day tavern is probably just out of the photo at the right. And looking up through the magnificent limestone gorge of the Pororari River up to the Paparoa Tops and Paparoa National Park. Also of great interest in the foreground is just the way the whole river and the beach has changed. Of course, the beach has receded, and the river, that flood channel over the back there, is more grown up now, and the river just comes more or less straight out and floods. But unmistakably the same place. Oh, yeah, this is what was called the post office, or the post office cave. Now, back in the 1860s, when people were just travelling the beach highway in conditions slightly less hazardous than we saw in the very first picture with Heafy and Brunner, those flax and rata ladders that Heafy and Brunner climbed up on the Tomiko cliffs were replaced during the gold rush by iron chains with timber rungs through them to make very crude ladders. So many diggers went up and down that those rungs wore out in a matter of months, apparently, and they were slithering up and down the chains. And it was after that that Kinnersley decided to put in the inland pack track, which is now the major walking track in the Paparoa National Park. But anyway, people making this dangerous coastal trip would eventually get to the Pororari Lagoon, so at the north end of the Pororari River crossing, and there they would have to wait for the tide. And crossing Bullock Creek, another thing they always mentioned was quicksand, and if you want a real thrill, you can walk out there now and get caught in quicksand yourself. There's still quicksand there, so it was a pretty hazardous crossing, and well, the whole trip was hazardous, of course. Now, people waiting to make that crossing would stop in an overhang, which later became known as the Post Office Cave. And the reason for that was that if you wanted to let somebody know you'd got that far safely, you would write them out a note, and then you would leave it there in a prominent position, probably under a rock or something, and then somebody else later travelling north might see it there, pick it up and say, oh yeah, I can do that, and take it up and leave it with whoever you wanted it delivered to at, say, Westport or Charleston or somewhere like that. And so that's how it became Post Office Cave. And there was apparently another one on the other side of the Pororari, but there's no trace. We've looked around for where it might have been, but haven't found it. And this was probably fairly common at a good many river crossings throughout the west coast on the old beach highway. But the difference with this one, you can see the names that were written up there, and they were still visible for years. In fact, when I went to Punakaiki in the early 80s, you could still see some of the names, but they were finally weathering off, and weed and stuff was, or native weed, was coming out over and covering some of them up. And the other sad thing was that even from the 1920s and 30s, other people had found the place and had started putting their names up next to, and in some cases over, the historic names that had been written up there since the 1860s. But somebody fortunately did have a look in the 1920s, I think it was, and deciphered as many of them as he could. And there were things like, Joe Brown duffered out of here in 1866 or whatever. In other words, he tried the beach for gold and found it was no good. Just those sort of things that today we would frown upon it, people writing their names on things, but there it was an essential part of our history, really. And here we have the first tea rooms at Punakaiki, I believe. Now this is another place that had a long farming history, and I mentioned, or we showed you the picture of the O'Callaghan children. Well, this is where they had lived in the 1920s. Their father bought the farm for some huge amount of money. I think it was his rehabilitation money after serving in World War I or something. And he bought it in the early 20s, and they walked off it in about 1927. But of course, there are always other people who are eager to take up a place, and this was a Christchurch family in the background. The people in the front are tourists who've come there, but the people who ran the place had come over from Christchurch. I think the woman had health problems, and she'd come to the west coast. It must have been in a fine period, but I suppose she got out of the smog and the winter cold of Christchurch, came over to the west coast, found it was a much healthier place to live, and so they arrived and took up this house that had been abandoned at Punakaiki. And the place was still totally isolated, still no road. I think the road finally got put through while they were there. But they lived there for many years, and the owner of the place became more or less, he became a voluntary ranger. But again, as I was saying before, it was very much a subsistence lifestyle. So what they did, with more tourists coming through, decided to open a little tea room. Now, their name was Ross, and the advantage of having a name of Ross is that it had two S's in it. And so you had your sign Ross's Tea Rooms or Ross Tea Rooms. And if you were very smart, you put the S's back to front. And he reckoned that having the S's in his name back to front was worth at least 1 cup of tea a day in the busy season, because people would come in just to correct your spelling, and they would buy a cup of tea as well. And so, yeah, there they are in the little old abandoned cottage that served them very well when they took it up. And, of course, they had the associated little farmlet and that sort of thing. And further up the road, on the other side of the present main road, if you know where to look, there is still a little overhang in the limestone rock, just enough room to put a couple of cows, and that was in fact the O'Callaghan's and then later the Ross's little cow byre, where they worked their daily milk, and of course they'd have a few sheep and things like that. And the other thing that Mr. Ross did was take people down to the bottom of his farm, which was what we now call Truman's Beach, at the bottom of what we now call Truman's Track. And here are the Trumans, the whole family, and you can see they really know how to have a picnic. They're very well kitted out. And this is down in the area that is now named after them. People say, why the Truman Track? Well, it was simply that Mr. Ross had tried the tourism thing, but the trouble was people would go down there with him once and pay for the privilege. But after that, they knew where the beach was and they wanted to go down, and they didn't want to pay for a guide. And they'd go down through his farm and leave the gates open and things like that annoyed him a bit. So the place was becoming really well known, and he decided that he would give the government, I think it was 8 links or something, just a very narrow strip on the southern boundary of his property to form a track. So that was duly handed over, and for decades the government department concerned did nothing about it. So he'd given the land away and he still had people going through his farm. And in fact, in the 1950s, when he decided to get a lot of the timber logged, because there was a sawmill at Punakaiki, which I also have a photo of somewhere, he decided to ask for that bit of land, the strip of land he'd given for a track, back again, because it had some good trees on it. And fortunately, he was refused, and that's why we still have so many trees along the Truman Track, because if he'd got the land back again, some of those trees would have been felled. Anyway, the Truman family, who had a batch there, Mr. Truman had Truman's Fashions, I think it was, large shop in Greymouth. They had a batch at Punakaiki, and one of their favourite places was down that beach. And to get down there more easily, they formed the track in the end, down through, partly through the land that Mr. Ross had given them, partly through government land. And that was later developed, and it's always been known ever since as the Truman Track. This would be just north of Punakaiki, so we've come up over Gentilani, as they call it, and where the Tomiko Cliff is. Gentilani actually referred to the beach down below, because that was where the diggers walked, and they got around all the difficult coastline around Punakaiki, and then you got easy going along the beaches until you got into more rocky stuff going towards Fox River. This car looks as if it's coming up around Mabel Bay. It looks a lot flatter than it really is, but in Mabel there's all sorts of fancy stories about why Mabel Bay was named, but I think it's because Theophilus Mabel, the surveyor who was employed there by the Nelson government, just thought it was such a beautiful bay, he named it after himself, as he was wont to do. He named quite a few other things after himself. But nowadays the spelling's been altered, and there's been a legend about a Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Mabel or something, but in fact it was the surveyor who would have named that. And who could blame him? Such a beautiful place. You would want to name it after yourself if you got half the chance, I'd say. Yeah, a feature of the old coast road that's still there if you look. This photo's taken from the vicinity of maybe it was taken actually when the old timber bridge that's still there was being built, because it seems to be from somewhere out in the river. And this was the cave that was extended into a tunnel before they had the bridge. In order to get to the fording point upriver, they extended the cave into a tunnel. So if you go to Fox River today, you go north of the present road bridge and then cross the road, walk back across the timber bridge to the Greymouth side of the river, then go to your left and you'll see that tunnel. And that's you still walk through, but you can't get right to the river because the river has changed now. But that was largely driven just with what they called hammer and tap by two people, just one with the drill and one with the hammer, drilling the holes to put in the explosions and then blasting it and mucking it out, and they drove their way through, and that tunnel was in use for about 2 years until the timber bridge was built, and so fording of the river was done away with. And here, just across the river, across the Fox River, is the town of Brighton. And that was a very fast-growing place and a rapidly diminishing place after the gold ran out. In fact, there was rich gold around Brighton, but there was never a big enough area to really last. But there were people who carried on right into the 20th century, still sluicing, etc., working the ground on a larger scale. But Arthur Dobson of Arthur's Pass fame walked through there one day in 1866 or 67 and counted something like 53 hotels. And I think a lot of the legend that's been attached to Charleston, actually the hotel numbers that people tell you about at Charleston were actually Charleston and Brighton combined, because Brighton was a much bigger place in terms of numbers of these shanty-type hotels than Charleston ever was. And something else that Brighton was that Charleston wasn't was an overseas port. It was actually a port of entry, and in the background there you can see the signal mast, and the little building next to it was the custom house. And beyond that is the headland where the cave is. If you go in there, there's another cave in there that was visited by Heafy and Brunner and used extensively by the Maori. And then out beyond that again is Seal Island, which you can still see and at low tide visit. So yeah, that was Brighton, a short-lived place in our history, but certainly a significant one in its time. Up north of Brighton, Fox River, up at a place they called St Kilda, and in the early days you could get from Brighton to St Kilda on the horse tram that ran along the beach. Later on they got the track, and that was it, and that's the walking track that was until the 1920s when they put the present main road along there. And if you walk along there you can still recognise that bluff there is still perfectly recognisable, but actually there's probably less bush between the road and the sea nowadays. Now the place on the right was the last building in St Kilda. I think the last two buildings at the township of St Kilda were one of the churches and the pub. And that was the old St Kilda, Billy Robertson's St Kilda Hotel there on the right. And they say that Billy would be often out doing other things like catching crayfish or just catching ordinary fish or up the back on his gold claim. So he'd just leave a note on the bar and say, "I'm at the gold claim," or "I'm off fishing," whatever applied, "serve yourself." And so people did. Billy was later retired to Westport, and the pub was just left there, and people used to use it passing by because a lot of people were swagging their way through, or even in the days of cars you couldn't always be sure that you were going to get to the end of the journey, so people would just use the old hotel, and eventually I think somebody left a fire burning there, or the chimney was faulty or something, and like so many of our old buildings it just burned down. Yeah, this is the second of two paintings by Jim Alexander, who lived at Rotherglen. Back in the 1970s he probably painted these. Based them on well-known West Coast photos. This one is actually Charleston, and taken from the Flagstaff Hill, and that's Constant Bay, and the buildings pretty much as they were, but he's managed to put this little steamboat buzzing around in the harbour in Constant Bay. Not entirely accurate. Certainly little sailing boats like cutters and ketches and schooners got into Constant Bay, and in several cases didn't get out again. but the steamships tended to moor outside, and even if they did get into the bay, there wasn't really enough room for them to go sailing around like that one appears to. But a wonderful painting, and he did many of these paintings just based on these well-known photographs, and that's the whole collection is now at Shantytown, and I think you can go there and see large parts of our West Coast history as depicted by this guy Jim Alexander. Yeah, third in the three ghost towns, well, Charleston is still there, of course, and Brighton to a very slight extent, but this one is one you would drive past now, you would never know there'd been anything there. This is Addison's Flat, just further north between Mountain Creek and Dirty Mary's Creek on the State Highway 6 as you get towards Westport. But here it is, the Shamrock Hotel, and we were talking earlier about the different nationalities reflected in the hotel names. That could be none other than Irish. And this would have been very late in the piece, just about the time that it closed. I think it lost its licence in 1939 or 1940. And next to it would be the local hall. And of course, so many of these towns did have halls. Addison's Flat, named after what we would now call an Afro-American prospector, a fellow named Addison. We only know him by his surname. We don't know what his first name was. But it always intrigues me that at the time that the American Civil War was being fought to free the Negroes, as they were then called, in United States of America, here was one of them out on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island and discovering 2 or 3 gold fields. He's known at Point Elizabeth, where it was known as Darkey's Terrace. There was another Darkey's Terrace at Charleston, and then there was Addison's Flat, and it's said that he found the gold there, then went to peg out his claim, except it was a Sunday, so that gave the diggers plenty of time to get there, and so on Monday, when it came time to legally peg the claims, everybody was ready. And so there was a fair bit of rivalry going on for the limited amount of ground that there was, certainly not enough land for everybody to get a claim. So they tended to arm themselves with things like pickaxe handles and generally went for it. And there were some fairly sore heads, partly through celebrating because you'd got a claim, or partly through a spell of unconsciousness with the result that you didn't get a claim. Addison's Flat, the township, it was one of those places too, they kept finding gold under the township, so I think the township moved a few times. Later on they worked some very big claims, big sluicing claims up into the early 20th century, but the place certainly faded, and you would never tell that it was ever there, except you can still go in and visit the last trace, as in so many of these towns, the cemetery, which is signposted from this side of the main road, well worth a visit. Okay, the northern part of our journey then, we finish at Cape Fowl, and it was on the coast road in the days when the stagecoaches went northward up the beach from Charleston, but fairly soon after the Addison's Flat rush, the main road was diverted through there, and you went through the way that the main road does now. But no visit up the coast road is complete without going out to Cape Foulwind and of course Tauranga Bay, which is the place where the seal colony is. And then further north from that you can go to Cape Foulwind, follow the old railway line around part of it, and there's a great walkway. Also you can go up into the headland and look out over the old quarry and also see the modern lighthouse, plus the foundations for this lighthouse are still there. Lots of panels there to tell you the whole story of the place. And from the lighthouse you are looking out towards those rocks out there, the Black Reef and the steeples, which were a very early part of the West Coast history as far as the European history goes, because that is where some of the sealers were put back in the mid 19th century, before there was any Westport or any West Coast gold rush or anything. Sealers were put out there to get those unfortunate victims that swam ashore, and they got rather a lot of them too. So you can also see why Cape Foulwind was such an important place to the Maori too. There were great food resources, as there were all the way down the west coast, down the coast road, particularly at Punakaiki, which the name is translated as a spring or a well of food. So there were various places down there when they travelled that beach highway that they always knew were the best places to stay, because they were great food resources from the sea or from the rivers or from the forests.
So that brings us to the end now of this talk about the Coast Road. Les, I've learned an awful lot from what you've said today, and I want to thank you very much for doing this, and I'm sure it's going to be a really valuable resource for current people and for future generations as well. So thanks very much for that.
You're welcome, Jackie.